Small Arms Solutions is a greatly expanding company at the moment. We're now really happy to offer you guys an armor's manual. This particular armor's manual is on the M16 M4 family of weapons. As you may or may not know, I am an armor instructor. I have my own armor schools. I've also written armor's manuals for multiple manufacturers, including Colt, LMT, LWRCI, Core 15, just to name a few. So I've written manuals for many different companies. This manual that I'm offering right now is not specifically to one manufacturer. For instance, if you were to see a Colt manual specific to Colt or LMT specific to LMT, this manual is actually more of a generalization of everything from nomenclature, cycle of operations, firing and loading, general disassembly, depot level disassembly, reassembly, troubleshooting. It's very in-depth. It does talk about several different rifles. We've now made this available for you on Amazon. It's a complete color manual. We do talk also about magazine variations, some about rails. We do talk about ammunition as well. So it's a very detailed armor's manual. It's sort of a compilation of several of the manuals I've done throughout my career, taking the best from several of them. Also a lot of the stuff that's in there, for instance, when I was working at Colt, I used to have a pad that every time somebody would call in with a technical question, I would write it down. And then when I would do revisions of their manuals, I would update it to include those issues. And I have done that with this manual as well. So it is now live on Amazon. I do hope you guys take a look at it, and I think you'll find it very useful as a reference material. Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're going to be doing part 2 of our series on the M4 carbine development. We left off at the global war on terrorism, the adoption of the M4 carbine, and the sort of the transition from the M4 carbine being a sort of a rear echelon type rifle into a main battle rifle. This part here is going to start off really with SOCOM, because that's where this problem begins and ends. SOCOM has used variations of the M16 carbine going back to the Vietnam War. Now, prior to the M4 carbine, these were all what was called COTS rifles, or commercial off-the-shelf rifles, meaning they were not technical data package rifles. They were not rifles that were officially adopted. They were given the prefixes XMs or XM16 or XM4. For instance, they used a lot of the M16A1 carbines in the 80s. Now, those M16A1 carbines were not U.S. government M16A1 carbines, because there never was one. They were the commercial off-the-shelf or the Colt export models. With the M4 coming into service, the guys who've been using the M16A1 carbines and then the commercial M16A2 carbines, they liked the M4, and they put them into service immediately. And as the war began, SOCOM started experiencing problems with the M4. Now, they always had a separate model. They had the M4A1 carbine, which the earliest versions of the M4A1 carbine were basically the M4 with the fully automatic selector setting instead of 3-shot burst. They started to experience problems with bolts breaking, barrels blowing up, to the point where they went to Colt and said there was some deficiencies in the rifle and they were having problems. Now, Colt again was producing these as technical data rifles. They were actual TDP rifles that were sold to the U.S. government. And as being a TDP rifle, there was a set of drawings, there were prints, there were specifications that had to be met for the guns to be delivered to the U.S. government. And of course, SOCOM got the rifles from the regular Army, out of Anniston Army Depot. And the Army was not having these issues with the M4 carbines. They were not having issues with barrels blowing. They were not having issues with bolts breaking prematurely. So, of course, the Army was telling Colt that this rifle's fine, we're not going to authorize any changes. Well, SOCOM really made a major stink about this, to the point where they had there was various papers that were written that were saying the rifle was, quote, fundamentally flawed. I mean, there was all kinds of issues that they were claiming that the rifle was less than suitable for military use. But again, this was not the Army's usage; it was theirs. They had approached Colt about making changes. Colt said no. Says this rifle, we have to get approval from the U.S. government to be able to make those changes. SOCOM, I think, got to the point where they wanted their own rifle. They did not want a rifle that they had to get permission from the U.S. government to make changes to. They wanted one that they would be able to be the project leader on. They'd be able to make out the requirements, make any changes. They would be able to do everything that they wanted and set out a new requirement. Because quite frankly, the U.S. mil specs for the M4 with a mere 6,000 rounds acceptance, that really wasn't acceptable by SOCOM. Now the M4 was going 2-3 times that for as far as its durability and reliability. But SOCOM uses these rifles much differently than regular Army does. I'll give you a really good, for instance, SOCOM, again, as you know, they are in very small teams. They do have one particular type of a mission where if they have to break engagement, they will actually have 2 guys basically pouring down heavy volumes of fire, and these other guys evacuate. So basically you're dumping magazine after magazine after magazine. So they're trying to turn this little 6.5 or 7 pound carbine into a light support weapon. This is what causes barrels to burst. The rifle was never designed for this purpose. So onset the SCAR program, or the Special Operations Command Combat Assault Rifle Program. This was, in fact, SOCOM's desire to have their own rifle. Now, at this same time, Colt was going through some issues with quality control. This was around the 2002 time period. Now, as somebody who's worked for Colt and who's been studying this the entire life, I can tell you that Colt's issues with quality control have been nearly non-existent. There was a very brief time in the early 2000s, around 2002, 2004, where they had quality deficiency reports, where they had issues that were all related to broken bolts and barrels. But interestingly enough, all these issues all came from SOCOM. They did not come from regular Army. I can also tell you by being at Colt that every time guns were made for the U.S. government, there was randomly selected rifles that went through 6,000 round endurance tests. They would go through parts interchangeability, and I can tell you at the time that I had been there, which would probably be 2008 through 2010 or so, I can tell you I actually never saw one of the tests that actually guns failed. And I used to have my nose back in that area quite a bit. I used to walk back there a lot. So again, Colt's quality control, the issues were pretty much nil when it came to the production of the M4 carbine. They really got it down to a science. But it was those early years in the global war on terrorism where SOCOM had these issues. At that point, it wasn't made clear that this was in fact a SOCOM issue, not regular Army. So the SCAR program commenced. They set forth their requirements, what they wanted. Now, SOCOM, it wasn't written in the requirements, but it was pretty clear they did not want a direct gas rifle. They wanted an external piston. So several manufacturers put rifles in. Now, FN at the time was developing actually 2 of these requirements for the most part. The FN, their SCAR rifle, the 5.56 millimeter. Now, the SCAR program, initially, the manufacturers had to provide proof of concepts that were 5.56 millimeter or were considered the SCAR Light. There was also a component called the SCAR Heavy, which was going to be a 308 version of the rifle. The SCAR Heavy was to replace several of the 7.62 caliber rifles, the bolt actions, the M110s, the various Navy models that they had out there. But the SCAR Heavy only had to be out there in concept. It had to be basically drawn up. It did not have to be presented. So FN produced their SCAR, which was called the Mark 16 at the time. Colt actually introduced 3 rifles. There was a Type A, B, and C. The Type A was a direct gas with Colt's new one-piece upper receiver. The Type B was a standard upper receiver with an armed SIR system on it, standard 14.5-inch barrel, and the Type C was their first external piston since the days of the Vietnam War. There were some other guns in there as well, but when it was all said and done, the final 2 rifles that came out were the FN rifle and the Colt Type C. Now, there's been a lot of information out there that's been very incorrect on the actual trials themselves, on how they went. But the SCAR 16 was not, Mark 16 was not the clear winner. The actual Type C Colt and the FN were neck and neck. I've interviewed several Navy SEALs actually and other people who were part of these trials to get the actual real results of what happened. And again, these guns were neck and neck. There was not one that was considered better mechanically than the other. When the testing was done, the guns came in equal. They went to the operators and said to them, which one do you like better? They looked at the Type C SCAR, and they said, well, basically they felt that this was an updated version of what they already had. They looked at the FN system, and they said that, we see a lot more life in this one. We see a lot more ability to move forward with it. And we want to go with the new rifle. So the FN Mark 16, or this is the commercial version of the SCAR 16 and 5.56 millimeter, was adopted. And the SCAR 16 program would move forward, but it would not have it was not a smooth road. At the same time that the actual trials were going on with the Mark 16, Colt had basically made some changes to the quality control of the bolts and the barrels. SOCOM had also introduced the new heavy barrel, which was basically a significantly heavier 14.5-inch barrel. And what this did was it allowed a couple things. First of all, the issue with the barrels blowing. Now, this was never at any point a problem with the manufacturing or a problem with Colt. And again, the regular Army didn't see this issue. The problem with what would actually cause these bolts or these barrels to blow was these engagements where they would have the two guys who would basically just lay down magazine after magazine after magazine. Once you reach around 14 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, the barrel goes through what's called a transformation temperature. And what that transformation temperature is it actually loses its heat treating. So once it reaches that point, at any point that barrel can actually blow because there's no more heat treating on it to actually contain the blast. The metal is now soft and it's ready to go. Now there's a couple different ways this was shown by SOCOM. First was during firing, the actual barrel would blow, and where it would blow would be right behind the front sight base. Right behind the front sight base is the hottest point of the barrel. That's also where your pressure peak is. So what happened was the gas would blow out the side, and you would occasionally have parts of the projectile go out the side as well. To my knowledge, nobody really was ever hurt from it, but there was definitely a really good possibility that they could be. Because again, if your hand was up there could be a problem. Fortunately, most of these guys use vertical pistol grips, so their hands were never near it. The second one was they would say that, I went out and fired my first couple rounds and the barrel blew. Well, what happened there was the last time that rifle was used, it was brought up to that transformation temperature, but the firing ceased before the barrel actually blew. So as soon as they took it out the next time, first couple shots, the barrel would blow. So what happened was SOCOM developed this new 14.5-inch heavy barrel. There was two slats that were cut in the front of the barrel right behind the front sight base, which was used to install the M203 grenade launcher. This solved several issues. First of all, it increased accuracy on semi-automatic because it was a heavy barrel. Two, with the increase in mass, the threshold for heat was drastically improved for as far as sustained fire. In fact, it was so different where your standard M4 barrel in a destruction test probably would go 11, 12 magazines, 15 in that area there before you'd actually have it blow because it would reach that temperature. This thing here would go well beyond 20, 25 magazines easily. In fact, when these would fail, they would fail because you would actually have gas going around the projectile because you would have that much erosion. You would not have issues with the bolts or the barrels blowing in the same way. That was the first one. And for as far as the bolts were concerned, there was definitely some quality control issues. Colt got that under control with some modifications in the manufacturing process. And the bolts, the life of the bolts increased drastically. Now again, at that same time, with the bolts that were breaking, SOCOM went to Carl Lewis and asked Carl Lewis to provide, if he could design a bolt carrier mechanism that would increase the reliability of the M4. And he did. Carl Lewis's answer to the bolt carrier group is what we see right here. This is commercially available today. This really did everything that SOCOM wanted. It was a combination of the bolt and bolt carrier. First of all, we're going to take a look at the bolt carrier itself. The bolt carrier is slightly heavier. You also notice that the actual exhaust port was moved forward and up compared to being down here. What that did was it vented gas out before the bolt carrier actually went into the receiver, so it allowed more gas to be able to be vented outside of the receiver. Also, you notice you have 3 different exhaust ports here, which allowed more gas to exit. The most important feature was the cam track itself. The actual cam track was actually modified so it increased the dwell time by having a longer cam track, which allowed the bolt to remain closed longer. When you allow the bolt to remain closed longer, what that does is it allows residual pressures to drop more, so more of the cartridge case can contract, so it's a much easier extraction, and it's easier on the extractor spring, and you have far less likely of a chance to have a failure to extract. So this was a major improvement over it. And also the way the actual gas was introduced into the carrier itself. Instead of the gas being straight down and completely dumped right into the top, it actually is vented off into a left and right channel, so which more evenly distributes the gas. And this also helped increase the dwell time. So the carrier itself was a major improvement. Now we're going to take a look at the bolt itself. The bolt he did a complete overhaul on. He selected and did a lot of different major enhancements to that as well. First and foremost, you'll notice that there is actually a proprietary nickel finish on here. And if we also take a look at the actual locking lugs themselves, you'll see there's actually a recess cut in there. What that does is it allows the locking lugs to flex, which will increase the strength rather than have them break off. I can honestly tell you that I've been using these bolts for years. I have never been able to break one. The durability is absolutely incredible. He also did a massive improvement to the extractor itself. Now the extractor spring is very limited on what you can do with it due to the spring compartment that's actually in there. You only have so much, so much you can actually squish a spring down. So what Carl did was he actually uses 2 springs instead of 1. And those 2 springs is a massive improvement on extraction, not only the extraction force, but the longevity of the spring. The actual extractor has been remodified as well. You can see where the 2 springs are, but you can also see that the extractor claw itself here is significantly more aggressive. It actually will grab more of the rim itself, and it's also a lot deeper in here, so it gets much better hold on it. And you'll also see that there's a groove right in here. This is actually a crud groove, so you get brass chips, you get various different kinds of debris will go in here and it will not affect the actual extractor's movement itself. Now the bolt itself, as you see here, is what's referred to as fully supported. If you look right here, you'll see on a regular bolt, you'll see where this area is cut off where the extractor actually fits over. This is not. This actually fully supports the whole base of the cartridge case. This increases durability, especially in over-the-beach conditions. It's much more durable. He has an improved extractor spring in here as well. Now, like any military bolt, it's magnetic particle and proof tested, meaning they take a 70,000 psi proof cartridge, they fire it, and then they inspect for any kind of wear. So overall, you have a much stronger steel here as well. This is not the standard carpenter steel. This is a much stronger steel. This is one of Carl's secrets he will not reveal. But this bolt made a major difference. It did everything that they asked to do. Well, a couple things happened why this wasn't actually adopted. Even though this bolt carrier group did everything that they wanted it to do, it was never adopted. There was actually a couple reasons for it. Probably the first and foremost was this was not compatible with the 20-inch barrel rifles. Due to the increase in the dwell time, it caused issues on fully automatic. You get a lot of bolt carrier bounce and the rifle wouldn't fire, so you didn't have a forward compatibility with this bolt carrier. However, the bolt was completely compatible. Second was as I referred to, Colt only had those issues around the 2002 time period. Once that problem got corrected, the issues with the bolts breaking really went away. I mean, it still happened after it reached the end of its life, but the problem stopped. It stopped being a problem even for SOCOM. So now we'll move forward with the new M4A1. The new M4A1 had a couple of things that were changed. First of all, it had the new heavy barrel. Second of all, it had a modification kit to the bolt carrier group. They had a product improvement kit, which actually had a new ejector spring. It had a rubber O-ring. That rubber O-ring went around the extractor spring on the M4A1. What that did was it increased your extraction by a factor of 4. Actually, it was incredible. The next thing they did was they added a new gas ring to it. Instead of having the standard 3 gas rings, they went with a McFarland gas ring. Now, what that's benefit is really, to me, had remained to be seen. I never saw that much of a benefit to that, but they had it. And also at the same time came the SOCOM program, which basically was SOCOM kitting up the rifle to be able to do various different missions. This would include the Mark 12 SBR upper receiver, which you've seen one video on the Mark 12 Mod 1. You are about to see in the near future one on the Mark 12 Mod 0 and the Mark 12 Mod Holland. You'll be seeing those. And also the Mark 18 short SBR upper receiver for close quarter battle. And there's also new handguards. You had the M4 RAS that was put on there. Actually, at that time it was the RIS. Backup sights. There was a whole different program that gave enhanced kit, for that. Well, as the development went further on the Mark 16, they had issues with the actual lower receivers themselves, and probably 4 or 5 years went on before the guys from SOCOM, specifically the Navy SEALs, said, we want to keep our M4A1s. At that time, the problems went away with the M4A1. They liked the gun better than the Mark 16. It felt better to them. They were more familiar with it. And quite frankly, they could not justify the cost of going to a different rifle when what they had now works. So the Mark 16 was dropped. And the primary weapon would go on to be the new updated M4A1 for SOCOM. Now, the Mark 17, on the other hand, was a complete different issue. The Mark 17 would go on to replace the M110, some of the other types of 7.62 rifles in the inventory of SOCOM, and also with the battles raging on in Afghanistan, where you were starting to see more longer range hits or longer range opportunities. It started to see more of a regular role in it as well. Now the M4A1 still, and it still is to this day, the primary weapon of SOCOM across the board. You'll see some small units that may have HK416s, not very many, but there are some that will. But the M4A1 will remain the weapon of choice. So the SCAR program now ended for the Mark 16. The M4A1 is now moved forward. And the Mark 17 in 7.62 NATO is now in development. So now, as we go forward in the global war on terrorism, I would probably say around the 2006-7 time period. Right after the end of the SCAR program, there were some people out of the Army's Special Armies Delta who still felt that the M4 was not acceptable for their use. One of the gentlemen, a very well-known gentleman, his name is Larry Vickers, he commenced to work with HK on the development of a new product. And that new product would enter the marketplace probably right around the 2004 time period as the HK M4. The HK M4, basically what it did was Larry, along with a couple other guys at H&K, they designed a external piston version of the M4 carbine. Now, this from the get-go was interesting because the original HK M4 rifles, there was no ejection port dust cover because they said it wasn't needed. It had the HK, the incredible barrels that they have. It was not fluted, but it was the same, really high quality steel. The whole mechanism was proprietary. The bolt carrier. The initial bolt carrier actually had it appeared to be like a carrier key, but it was one piece, and then you had the external piston. It was very much an overgassed system. It was overgassed. That's what made the thing work. It was overgassed. And the HK M4 was now introduced into the SOCOM community as well as the regular Army. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this at the time at a lot of different levels. First off was the term HK M4. At the time, Colt had a trademark on the M4 actual itself. The second thing was HK went on a pretty aggressive campaign to get the HK-M4 noticed. Several writers from various defense magazines began to run articles on this thing. And with those articles were claiming that there was a better rifle out there, and that meaning the HK-M4. It was a better rifle, and the U.S. military was ignoring it, or they were not allowing it to be tested as a potential replacement from the M4. HK knew that the only way they were going to replace the M4 was to basically claim that it was in fact deficient, because Colt had the entire production locked down in their sole source. I really have to say that in Defense Review and several of these other magazines were constantly running very negative reviews, basically telling soldiers that were in the field that their gun was inferior, that there was a better gun and the U.S. military wouldn't allow it. Henceforth came a couple more things. One was a lawsuit. Colt decided to go after HK for the infringement of the trademark, and also there was some defamation, I think, that went on there as well. They were quite upset about things that were being said about the M4 that were not true. Bushmaster also was in on that as well. Colt went after them for the trademark, as well as some some other issues. Well, the HK settled out of court, and what they did was they dropped the name HK-M4 and they went to the HK-416. So that totally eliminated the issue with the trademark on the M4. However, Bushmaster decided to go forward with it, and when a judge looked at it, they discovered that that M4 was not a proper trademark. It was used in common usage. It was a U.S. military designation, and therefore Colt had no right to have it as a trademark, and the trademark was revoked. So now Colt had lost the trademark M4. Now anybody could actually use it. I think HK decided they were going to go with their own rifle. They were not going to go back to the M4. They have their own new product, the HK-416. And some of the SOCOM units, not all of them, had reported issues with the M4, where of course the 416 sounded like it was going to be the solution. Now we start getting a little more political. It got so bad that a congressman actually went to the Department of Defense and demanded that they have an open trial for open competition for a new rifle. Senator Carbine was basically convinced, even though he was not an arms expert, that there was a better weapon out there, that the M4 was not the best for the soldiers. The Army came back and actually issued a press release saying that the M4 has been a complete success. It is the most sought-after rifle in the U.S. military. With a couple of different soldiers, when soldiers who came back, they would actually do a review of what they thought of their weapons, what they thought of their equipment. There was one called A Soldier's Perspective on Small Arms, and the M4 had over 80%. People said that this rifle worked perfect for them. They had no issues. And then, of course, you had a small segment where they had said they had issues. They had issues that affected them in combat, and they had comments. One of the more seen comments was they weren't unhappy with the rifle itself. They were unhappy with the caliber. They wanted a larger caliber, which is where the 6.8 sort of got some push for it to be developed. So again, the Army was not aligned with SOCOM for as far as the rifle program. So the first test that was basically forced to be done was called to the extreme dust test. Due to the environment in the Middle East, with the sand and such, there wanted to be an actual comparison between the M4, the XM8, the HK-416, and the Mark 16. The XM8 is a total issue in its own. HK was not involved really with the SCAR program, because at that time they were working on the XM8 is a new replacement for the M4 as a complete system. The XM8 is very much a modified G36. The XM8 had several issues. One, there was no requirement for it. Two, there was no open and competitive bid. 3, it was done by a foreign government, and it was promptly canceled by the U.S. government. So the XM8 never really had its day, really due to the fact that the whole project the whole program was being run wrong. But the XM8 was one of the rifles that was actually tested in this extreme dust test. Now, the extreme dust test, in my opinion, is a completely flawed testing protocol because the data was not repeatable. In the summer of 07, the dust test came through, which basically what they did was they took all these rifles, they put them in a environmental chamber, and they were submitted to what you would refer to as a dust storm or a sand test, where you would have the sand blowing, and it would try to mimic the conditions that you would have in Iraq or in some parts of Afghanistan. In the summer of 07, an M4 was tested, and that was referred to as dust test 2, and you had of class 1 and 2 stoppages, there was 148. The magazines were 148 stoppages, and the total was 296 stoppages, with a total class 3 stoppages of 11, which is not all that much. Now comes the fall of 07, where we do Extreme Dust Test 3, where now we do an M4 along with an XM8, an HK416, and a Mark 16. Now keep in mind the XM8, the 416, and the Mark 16 were all brand new rifles. Most of them had brand new magazines, enhanced magazines. And all of a sudden things really went out of whack. Now all of a sudden you have the class 1 and 2 weapon stoppages went from 07 148 to now 624. The XM8 had 98, the HK416 had 210, and the Mark 16 had 191. Now, this is a major difference between 07 of the summer and fall of 07. So basically what that tells me is, first off, that the test was not done repeatably. Something was done wrong, or there was a way that it was being conducted that was not consistent with the first test. And we also want to talk a little bit about the fairness of the test, too. Colt was able to get the actual serial numbers of the guns that were used. These were older firearms. In fact, they were really early generation M4s. The condition of those guns was not known at all, whether they were new rifles going up against new rifles or what the condition was. There were rumors that the people who were operating it did not understand the burst mechanism, and they actually counted what they would say as failures in the burst mechanism as not resetting, which they didn't understand how it worked. Now we're going to go to magazine stoppages. Now also we want to talk about that the XM8, 416, and the Mark 16 had new magazines, improved higher reliability magazines versus the aluminum ones of the standard M4. And also, what were the condition of those aluminum M4 magazines? Were these new magazines? Were they ones that were already in use? What was that? Well, the stoppages in 07 on the M4 were 148. Now, in the fall of 07, 239. You went from 148 to 239. XM8 had 18, HK416 had 9, which also had the new steel high reliability magazine. Mark 16, which also had a proprietary magazine, not proprietary, but it was on a standard GI aluminum, had 19. So looking at that, first of all, lack of repeatability, and second of all, you're looking at a standard GI magazine compared to other brand new designs that were actually better designs, which, if you were to have tested these, they should have had the exact same Stenag magazine. The total number of Class 2 stoppages, Dust Test 2 in summer of 07 for the M4 was 295. In fall of 07 was 863. 296 versus 863. Something is wrong. Law enforcement, we call this a clue. Something was not done repeatedly. And we have the XM8 with 116, the HK416 with 219, and a Mark 16 with 210. So this testing, for as far as I'm concerned, was completely invalid. It was not done repeatably. It was not done with a proper scientific method. If it was, you would have seen consistent results from the fall and summer of 2007. But this was used in several military publications by several authors as being a definitive answer that there are better guns than the M4. So now the senator is now basically pushing an individual carbine or a new program to see if the M4 is actually the best gun for our troops. even though the Army already said it was, and it's the Army's job to be able to determine what in fact is best for their soldiers. They brought out all of their data to prove that point, but it appeared as though there was no way around this. Now, the individual carbine program, in my opinion, was something that the Army did not want to do. They felt that it was a waste of time and it was a waste of money. The M4 worked. It was happy. You had a lot of people out there who had a very, in my opinion, ignorant opinion that why are we still using a gun that's 50 years, 60 years old? Now, that's like saying why are we still using a tire because it's centuries old? There's no expiration date on a mechanism. If it worked in 1969, if it worked in 1970, if it worked in 1985, it's still going to work in 2000, 2005, 2000, 2010. There's no expiration date on an actual mechanism itself. The M4 had gone through several upgrades. It wasn't the same gun that it was in the early days, as the rifle went on to serve as not only the frontline weapon for special forces, it became the frontline weapon for all combat elements in Afghanistan and Iraq, too. It got to the point where the military had stopped procuring M16A2 and M16A4 rifles for the Army and for the Air Force. The Marines were really the stronghold on keeping the M16A4 at that point, and it was going pure fleet for all combat elements. And they had made some changes to the extractor mechanism. They had made some. There were several improvements, such as the barrel receiver extension nut. They improved that one as well. There was some issues with the carrier keys coming loose. They had corrected that, but there's a lot of small changes that were made to improve the rifle. So the open competition was put in motion. You had multiple manufacturers. I can't even recall all of them that actually submitted for it. Colt had put in their enhanced piston carbine, which was their external piston. You had the FN Scar had a version. HK put in a version of their 416. AdCore put in one of their Bear Elites. The Beretta ARX 100 was one of them, or ARX 160. So you had several of them that were going through testing at the time. LMT actually put in one as well, but very quickly a lot of them got knocked out. And again, I don't think that the Army took this test very seriously. The testing itself was done still only around 6,000 rounds. Now, a lot of the enhanced components that we're seeing on a lot of these rifles, if you were to go to 6,000 rounds, well, the current M4 works perfect at that. You would need to go to 12, 15, 20,000 rounds to see the advancement of some of these components, but the Army did not do that. So they stayed with that original protocol. The Downselect really came down to the ARX 100, the AdCore rifle, and the FN Scar, and I believe there was one other one. I can't recall it offhand. There's a Downselect of 4 of them. There was an opportunity for everybody in the industry to go to a military base to be able to test these rifles with the new M855A1 ammunition. Well, the new M855 ammunition destroyed all of the rifles. Basically, it cut the barrel life in half. It broke bolts. We're going to be doing a video on the M855A1 in the future, but the M855A1 had some issues. As a round, it's a perfect round. The problem was that we do not have a rifle that's designed to handle it. First and foremost is the actual port pressure itself. The port pressure is significantly higher. The standard 5.56 millimeters around 52 to 55,000 psi. Well, this is up around 60 to 63,000 psi. Now, keep in mind a proof round is 70,000 psi. So you're operating at nearly proof pressures. So first of all, you have the parts working much faster. They're working much, the rifle, the extractors are working harder. The barrels themselves are also being damaged by the round itself. The barrel life was cut in half, and you had parts breakages. So not one of the actual rifles themselves actually made it through. The project was eventually totally canceled, basically saying that there was no evidence that there was anything that was a significant leap of technology as an improvement over the M4 carbine. The project was canceled, M4 production resumed. However, there was what was referred to as a product improvement program that was made, because the M4 as it was, I definitely won't say it was a perfect rifle. There really is no perfect rifle, but there were some things that could be done to the rifle that would improve its performance. And this included, first off, a new bolt carrier mechanism, an enhanced bolt carrier group. They had that. They wanted a better rail than the M4 RAS. The M4 RAS was good in the early days, but it was definitely seen that a free-floating rail was the way to go. They looked at that, and they decided on two other very important issues. One was to get rid of the standard profile M4 barrel and I'll go to a pure fleet on the M4 heavy barrels that SOCOM was using. That was one, and another change that came down the pike was making the rifle ambidextrous, being able to have an ambidextrous safety, an Oregon ambi magazine release, and an ambi charging handle. So this program was started implemented. They started doing fleet upgrades on these, and all the rifles that were being procured after this point were all going to be M4A1 rifles. In fact, right now, what FN is producing for the U.S. government are all M4A1 rifles. Well, in the Army's infinite wisdom, not too long after this commenced, they stopped it. Never really gave a clear-cut explanation of why they stopped it. So basically, what existing rifles existed and all new procurement would all be of the M4A1 profile. So which leads us up to today. Today, the M4 carbine, M4A1 carbine actually, is serving the U.S. military throughout the globe. It's used by special forces, by our most elite special forces. It's used by special forces throughout the world. Colt has sold these guns all over the world in various configurations. Interestingly enough, the standard M4 carbine with the 3-round burst, the U.S. government was the only customer that Colt ever sold the burst mechanism guns to. Everybody else was a lot smarter than the U.S. at that point, and they were getting the actual burst mechanisms. These rifles have seen combat throughout the world. Israelis, a lot of these guns were purchased through the Foreign Military Sales, or FMS rifles, which were guns that were directly provided by the U.S. government to our various allies throughout the world. It goes on to be the most produced and most proven 5.56 millimeter weapon system in the world. For as far as that term, the best weapon, and you can't have it, I do believe the U.S. military does have the best weapon. I believe that the new M4A1 carbine is, for a general rule, is an excellent rifle. I believe the M4A1 is going to cause a lot of problems with these rifles. The U.S. military right now is having infighting over it. The Army has been using this cartridge that has proven to have problems in not just the M4, but everything. In fact, just recently, the Marine Corps came out and said that their M27 IARs, HK IARs, are having severe difficulty functioning reliably with the M855A1 ammunition. So I think that we're going to see a lot of serious issues with the ammunition. In fact, the U.S. government also just introduced a new magazine for the M855A1 because the steel tip was actually damaging the inside of the receiver. It was damaging the barrel extension itself, as well as the outer part of the receiver, because the round's not being presented high enough. They just developed an enhanced performance magazine that actually allows that round to sit up properly. The Marine Corps have just switched over to the Gen 3 PMAG in flat dark earth. And in my opinion, the M3 PMAG, or Gen 3 PMAG, should be used across the board throughout the U.S. military. They've seen a dramatic amount of use in the global war on terrorism. Many units have bought them themselves through their own unit purchases, even though the U.S. government would not officially adopt them. It wasn't until recently with the Marine Corps adopting the PMAG. I do expect, again, I'm no mind reader, I can't tell the future. I would expect to see other branches adopting the PMAG because there is nothing better out there. But as of right now, my opinion, the DI M4A1, I believe, is the finest rifle that's out there for military use. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people out there that disagree with me. I would want a proper rifle. I would want one that's either manufactured by Colt or by FN. One of the biggest problems that this entire family of weapons has had in the global war on terrorism, where there's been a lot of complaints about them, had a lot to do with the actual replacement parts. The government has this thing about putting out to bid replacement components for pretty much every weapon in its inventory. And I was in Afghanistan probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. I was at Bagram Airfield at Camp Vance in their arms room in there, and I got a chance to see some really interesting things when it came to the second, third, fourth echelon components. We were working on some rifles there. We actually had 3 or 4 bolt carriers. I did not recognize the cage code, and I didn't recognize the carriers themselves. We actually could not assemble the cam pins into the into the bolt carrier groups. The actual cam track did not align properly with the bolt. So we're actually getting components like this that don't even conform to the drawings. We had seen bolts, or I had seen bolts that I knew were not Colt or FN. I don't know who made them. That had the lugs 1 and 7 broken off. I saw several that had the actual broken at the cam pin. Now keep in mind that Cam Vance was Special Forces. This was SOCOM. This was not regular Army. So these were guns that were being used pretty heavy. I had seen some Air Force rifles that you couldn't even pull the bolts back on them because you had a stack of tolerances on components in the inside that was so bad that you couldn't even pull the bolt back on the damn thing without, stepping on the charging handle, on the rifle. I think the U.S. government has destroyed a lot of weapons by bidding out parts to job shops that did not know how to properly make these components. This is the same story with the M9. A lot of the failures with the M9 were due to bad locking blocks that were not manufactured by Beretta. I do believe a lot of the problems that the M4 has had have been with components that were manufactured not by the OEMs but by other companies who did not know either how to manufacture them or had severe quality control deficiencies. Quite frankly, if you have a complete Colt or a complete FN rifle, those rifles very rarely see a lot of issues. Very, very rarely. And I could tell you of all the rifles that I saw that were in for maintenance in Bagram in Afghanistan, there were no rifles that were complete Colt or FN rifles. These were all bastardized with all kinds of components from people I didn't recognize. I've seen a lot of these components over the years. I can identify a lot of them, but a lot of these I had no idea who they actually were. The government has a major issue with parts, and it also has a major issue with actual maintenance itself. We had seen in Afghanistan, and Colt had seen also in some of its research, that weapons were not being turned in for depot level maintenance. They were not having parts replaced according to the replacement schedule. A lot of guys were afraid to turn the rifles in because they did not want them to be, they didn't want to lose them. They were afraid if they turned them in, they wouldn't get them back. And that was told by a lot of people that were over there as well. So I do believe that the Army has a lot to be desired, and SOCOM as well. I realize it's impossible to keep brown counts, but you would have guys from SOCOM, special operations guys, who would go into battle with rifles that they took training with them, and they had no idea how many thousands and thousands of rounds went through these guns at the time they were deployed. So, my opinion is anytime a rifle is being taken into to battle, especially within SOCOM, that you should not be taking the same rifles that you've trained with for thousands of rounds into combat. They should be rebuilt, new barrels, new bolts with those components, and that should be across the board. So, there are some issues with the M4. They're not necessarily because of the design. It has a lot to do with the support, in my opinion. I do believe that this controversy will go on forever. You do have guys who are in the external piston camp who believe that the only way to go is with an external piston. It's certainly good we have all these different choices. SOCOM has been divided on it as well. You do have some units that actually use the HK416. You also had, for instance, asymmetric warfare compared the 416 to the M4 and found the 416 was not acceptable for use. But you'll have another unit that will say that it is. So you have issues with conflicting reports depending on who it is. When you want to compare rifles and you want to say what's better, how do you determine what's better? Do you fire each one to destruction and see which one's better? Not really. That's not really how this all works. Any U.S. government weapon will have a set of requirements. So, for instance, say you have a set of requirements that states that your rifle has to go through a 6,000 round endurance test. Your standard M4 does it. Your 416 will do it. Your SCAR 16 will do that. So, which one's better? Well, all of them meet the requirement. So you actually have to have a requirement to something either meets or it does not. That's how the U.S. military does something. It's not basically saying we're going to fire them to destruction or not clean them and then we're going to see what goes on from there. It doesn't work that way. When you have a request for quote, you actually will have a set of requirements that it has in there. It will have its number of rounds the barrel has to take. It'll have to have the number that the bolt has to take. You have minimum numbers that the parts have to actually last. And that's how this is done professionally. It's not done just basically, firing them until it explodes. A lot of guys on YouTube like to do that. They like to do, we're just going to fire the gun until it explodes and we're going to see what's a better gun. It doesn't work like that. The military basically says a battle is 300 rounds. So they want 300 rounds without cleaning. and the gun, that's the requirement. Well, an M4 will do that all day long. In fact, I've seen endurance tests where they've gone 400 or 500 rounds easy with no maintenance. I personally done over 2,000 rounds without cleaning, just basically throwing some oil on there. So again, is an external piston gun better than the M4? No, they meet the requirements. So I think anybody who wants to say what's better, there's a process this has to go to, and that's the way that it works. The M4 meets and exceeds every every requirement that it's had put on it since its inception. The M16 as well. The A1s, the A2s, the A4s. They've always exceeded their requirements and then some. And I do believe this weapon is going to be with us for a long time, and justly so. A lot of what you've heard here is my experience of being around during a lot of these programs. There's a lot of inside information of what went on with those. Some of it is my opinion as well. Some stuff definitely will disagree with it. So please understand that some of this is in fact my opinion. Not saying right, wrong, or indifferent. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please send me some comments down. This is very in-depth and in detail. It really there's a lot of information I haven't given you. It's because we could go on for volumes with a lot of it. I've really given you the highlights of several of these programs, and hopefully you guys will learn something. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please click like and please subscribe. Thank you very much.